When Judge Stephen Breyer chuckled, no one expected what came next. The sound rippled through the courtroom like a low, mocking drumbeat, silencing whispers and turning heads toward the bench. Crockett stood at the center, calm but unyielding, a figure of quiet fire in the midst of polished wood and murmured tension. Every eye in the room, reporters, lawyers, spectators, even the guards, was fixed on him, waiting for the inevitable crack in his composure. There was none. Breyer's smirk widened, leaning forward slightly, as if the courtroom itself was a stage for ridicule. "Do you really think," he began, but Crockett's gaze, sharp and unwavering, cut him off mid-sentence. The judge faltered, caught off guard by a presence that refused to bend. Every gesture, every inhale from the audience felt charged, electric, as though the air itself had grown heavier in anticipation. The camera of imagination or reality, depending on who was watching, panned over the gallery. A mother clutched her child's hand. A journalist scribbled furiously. A young law student's jaw dropped in disbelief. Crockett's reputation had preceded him. The lawyer who refused to kneel, the man who held powerful men accountable while the world flinched. Yet now, standing before the Supreme Court, he faced a living symbol of establishment arrogance, a man whose chuckle could dismiss careers with a flick of a wrist. Breyer leaned back, exhaling, as if savoring the tension, relishing the spectacle. He underestimated the storm before him. Crockett spoke then, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. Deliberate, resonant, and daring. The words were not loud, but they carried the weight of every unheard plea, every silenced voice, every fight for justice that had come before this moment. Whispers rose, then stilled. A faint tremor ran through the courtroom, subtle but undeniable. The polished wood walls seemed to close in, spectators unconsciously leaning forward. Crockett didn't just respond. He challenged an entire legacy, exposing the fragile underbelly of assumed authority. And in that suspended heartbeat, everyone realized the balance of power had shifted, if only for a moment. The world outside the doors might never see it, but inside, a hero had emerged and the villain's laughter had faltered. But this was just the opening act. The courtroom was about to witness something unforgettable. The courtroom had always been a theater of power, but today it pulsed with something far more urgent. History in the making. Crockett wasn't just standing before a judge. She was standing before a symbol of the system itself. Every polished surface, every solemn nod from clerks and clerks' assistants, every whisper in the back rows told the same story. This moment was bigger than law, bigger than precedent. It was a mirror reflecting society's fractured ideals. To millions watching or imagining watching, the stakes were clear. Crockett carried the weight of truth, justice, and dignity, values too often treated as optional in the corridors of authority. She was the voice of those who had been dismissed, the courage of those silenced, the embodiment of integrity standing firm when the institution expected compliance. Breyer, by contrast, was the emblem of authority tested by defiance. His legacy, built over decades of respect and ritual, now faced a reckoning that no precedent could fully anticipate. Politically, this wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was a lightning rod for cultural discourse, a test of whether the system could bend toward accountability, without fracturing entirely. Socially, it was a mirror for every citizen who had ever felt invisible, every immigrant and marginalized voice whose claims had been shrugged aside as inconvenient. This confrontation was a referendum on courage itself, played out in real time beneath the austere arches of justice. Crockett's poise was almost defiant in its serenity. Each word she prepared, each subtle shift in posture, radiated intent. She wasn't merely responding. She was orchestrating a moment that demanded attention, daring the court to measure her against the full force of its authority. Breyer's initial amusement was gone, replaced by a careful observation, the kind that comes when predictable suddenly collapses. He had met resistance before, but resistance of this precision, this moral clarity, was rarer than he or anyone expected. Spectators felt it too, even those not present. The air outside the courtroom seemed to hum with anticipation, a collective leaning in, a shared pulse of curiosity and dread. This wasn't simply about one case or one argument. It was about setting a precedent of accountability that reverberated far beyond the walls of the Supreme Court. Every subtle glance, every measured breath, was a signal to the world that what happened here mattered, that it could inspire change, ignite debate, and leave an indelible mark on public conscience. And then the tension sharpened. Crockett opened her mouth, a single phrase forming, and in that split second, the entire courtroom, judges, clerks, spectators, felt it. She was about to deliver something seismic. What she says next will silence an entire court and leave the nation talking for weeks. Every mind leaned forward, every ear strained, every heart held its breath. The duel was not just intellectual. It was emotional, moral, cultural. It was a reckoning wrapped in words, a confrontation between the weight of tradition and the force of conviction. The world leaned in because everyone could feel something historic about to happen. Stephen Breyer's name carried weight. Decades of service on the nation's highest court had cemented him as a figure both revered and feared. He was the epitome of intellectual authority, measured in thought, deliberate in speech, and, to many, nearly untouchable in judgment. His opinions were cited, dissected, and debated in law schools across the country. Students memorized his reasoning. Scholars scrutinized the citations, and colleagues often deferred to him, not out of fear, but respect born of mastery. Breyer's presence alone lent gravity to any case, a living testament to the enduring power of institutional authority. Yet for all his brilliance, Breyer was not without human complexity. Beneath the tailored robes, beneath the careful cadence of argumentation, lay subtle cracks in his armor, arrogance, at times imperceptible to those untrained in courtroom nuance, colored his interactions. It was not malicious, but the natural byproduct of years spent in chambers where compromise often felt like surrender. He relied on the weight of precedent and the authority of the bench to guide outcomes, sometimes allowing tradition to shield him from the immediacy of moral or social nuance. A faint condescension could slip through, an eyebrow raised, a barely audible sigh when a point seemed beneath notice, reinforcing a hierarchy that favored experience over the daring of youth. Colleagues noted these tendencies in passing, dismissing them as quirks of temperament rather than flaws. Breyer himself might have called them pragmatism, the careful calibration required to navigate decades of political and legal pressures. Yet for someone like Crockett, who thrived in courage and clarity, those same tendencies became vulnerabilities. The courtroom, for all its formality, could not contain the collision between a rising force of conviction and the weight of institutional habit. It was this contrast that made today's confrontation electric. On one side stood Breyer, a man of impeccable credentials, steeped in law, the embodiment of centuries of judicial authority. On the other, Crockett, a newcomer whose reputation for unflinching resolve and moral clarity preceded her. She carried no titles, yet wielded an unassailable presence, a fearless insistence that truth was not subject to tradition. Where Breyer's strength lay in deliberation and deference to established norms, Crockett's power came from immediacy and moral audacity. Her rise was meteoric, fueled not by tenure, but by a refusal to compromise, a commitment to a vision of justice that did not bend to hierarchy. Breyer's initial laughter, then, was understandable. It was a reflexive response, shaped by decades of command and the expectation that the courtroom's rhythm would bend around him. He chuckled because, in his experience, challenges were rarely as precise or piercing as this. The laughter was not cruelty. It was a shorthand of authority recognizing novelty, the instinctive measure of a world accustomed to deference. And yet, that very instinct would become his weakness. Arrogance, subtle as it was, made him underestimate the weight of courage when it arrived fully formed. The audience could sense it, even if only subconsciously, a titan of law momentarily startled by the audacity of someone willing to confront him directly. In his long career, Breyer had seen countless arguments, had weighed thousands of appeals, and had honed an almost prescient ability to read the courtroom. Yet none of that preparation could fully anticipate the fire of conviction that Crockett brought, the moral gravity she carried into the room like a tangible force. Her defiance was not reckless. It was informed, calculated, and unyielding. And in that tension, the seeds of suspense were sown. The courtroom's polished walls could not contain a collision of tradition and fearlessness, intellect and audacity, power and principle. Even those loyal to Breyer would acknowledge a quiet truth. His experience, while formidable, was not infallible. The same habits that had guided him to the pinnacle of authority now left him exposed to disruption. He could analyze precedent, cite complex logic, and marshal decades of rulings, but he could not predict the moral clarity of a voice unafraid to speak truth to power. The laughter that opened the courtroom, intended as dominance, now hung as a fragile shield over a man whose legacy depended on perception as much as intellect. And so the stage was set. The veteran of countless battles faced a challenger unlike any before. Breyer's reputation loomed large, but Crockett's audacity shimmered like a new dawn on the horizon, promising upheaval in a space long dominated by tradition. In that delicate balance between authority and courage, the audience sensed tension, the rise of the fearless against the bastion of experience. Yet, even the most seasoned judges can be caught off guard. Jasmine Crockett's path to this courtroom was anything but conventional. She had grown up in neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce, where systemic barriers felt permanent, and where the voices of the marginalized were often ignored. From a young age, she understood the stakes of injustice, not as abstract legal principles, but as daily realities that shaped lives, dictated futures, and silenced hope. Her parents had instilled in her a fierce sense of dignity, a belief that integrity was non-negotiable, and that standing up for what was right often came with cost. Crockett carried those lessons with her into every room she entered, every case she took, and every life she touched. Her early career in public service was defined by tenacity. As a young lawyer, she sought out the cases no one else wanted, the ones where the odds were stacked so heavily against her clients that most would have walked away. She represented families denied justice, workers exploited, and communities neglected by institutions that claimed to serve them. Each case was a crucible, shaping her legal acumen while reinforcing her commitment to principles larger than any individual victory. Crockett learned quickly that law was not just about statutes and precedent. It was about people, about the ripple effect of decisions on real lives. Her victories were not always measured in headlines or accolades, but in the tangible relief, dignity, and protection she brought to those who had none. Yet the path of courage is rarely easy. Crockett faced resistance at every turn. She was underestimated, dismissed, and sometimes publicly derided. Authority figures who felt threatened by her integrity questioned her methods, her intentions, even her character. But each challenge strengthened her resolve. She learned to navigate bureaucracy without surrendering principle, to negotiate without compromising justice, to speak truth to power even when the consequences were personal. Every setback became a lesson, every criticism an opportunity to refine her strategy. She discovered that resilience was not simply enduring hardship. It was transforming adversity into fuel for greater impact. Her record was a testament to moral clarity. Crockett had confronted political inertia in city councils, challenged corporate abuses in courtrooms, and advocated for policies that expanded rights for those often overlooked. She had argued cases that drew national attention, not for spectacle, but because the stakes were high for ordinary people. Colleagues and opponents alike recognized her ability to remain calm under pressure, to find the thread of justice even in the most convoluted arguments, and to communicate with clarity and conviction that transcended legal jargon. Her intelligence was matched by empathy, her skill by courage. Where others saw complexity as a reason to delay or defer, Crockett saw opportunity, a chance to affirm dignity, to assert truth, to protect the vulnerable. Beyond the courtroom, her life had been a series of personal sacrifices. Long hours, missed family milestones, and public scrutiny tested her limits. Yet she endured, because she understood that the pursuit of justice demanded more than skill. It demanded heart. Crockett's empathy was not sentimental. It was actionable. She had walked beside clients through grief, fought relentlessly for causes that many deemed unwinnable, and refused to compromise when confronted with the easy path of political expediency. Every decision she made was informed by a moral compass honed through years of navigating both personal and systemic challenges. There were moments in her past that foreshadowed this confrontation with Breyer. In lower courts, she had faced judges who wielded authority like a cudgel, dismissing arguments with condescension or relying on tradition to avoid accountability. In legislative arenas, she had challenged entrenched interests, demanding transparency and fairness, even when the cost was professional alienation. Each instance built credibility, sharpened resolve, and prepared her for the day when the stakes would be higher, the audience broader, and the consequences more profound. These moments were not isolated. They were threads weaving a narrative of courage, skill, and unwavering principle. Crockett's rise was not just a story of talent. It was a story of preparation meeting opportunity. Her legal victories were earned through meticulous research, careful strategy, and an unshakable belief in the power of justice to effect real change. Her reputation for integrity preceded her, not because she sought accolades, but because those who worked with her, those who were defended by her, knew she would never compromise on principle. She had cultivated a presence that demanded attention, not through intimidation, but through the quiet force of competence and moral clarity. Now, standing in the courtroom, all of that history, the battles fought in darkened offices, the late nights preparing arguments, the sacrifices made in service of truth, coalesced. Every lesson, every challenge, every moment of quiet triumph had led her to this precise point. Crockett was no longer just a lawyer. She was a force of conviction, prepared to confront authority not with hubris, but with clarity, courage, and unwavering purpose. The courtroom, charged with expectation and history, would bear witness not only to a legal argument, but to the embodiment of every value she had ever championed. Now, every lesson, every struggle she endured would converge in this single, pivotal moment. The courtroom held its collective breath as Crockett leaned slightly forward, eyes locked on Breyer. The air was thick, charged with an almost tactile tension. A single cough echoed from the back row, quickly smothered by a rustle of papers. Every movement, every intake of breath, seemed amplified. This was no ordinary exchange. It was a collision of intellect and principle, tradition against audacity. Breyer spoke first, his tone carefully measured, but the edge of amusement remained, as if he were entertaining a curious novelty rather than confronting a formidable adversary. "Are you suggesting," he began, the words deliberate, "that precedent should yield so readily to passion?" His eyebrow arched slightly, a subtle challenge, a test of composure disguised as inquiry. The courtroom murmured in barely contained anticipation. A clerk adjusted his glasses. A journalist paused mid-note, sensing the unspoken stakes. Crockett's response was steady, her voice calm but resonant, each word chosen with precision. "Your Honor," she said, "passion is not the adversary here. Justice is. And justice does not bend convenience or tradition. It demands clarity, courage, and accountability." Her gaze did not waver, her posture neither aggressive nor defensive, but magnetic. The courtroom seemed to tilt ever so slightly toward her, as if recognizing the inevitability of her moral force. A pause followed, pregnant with anticipation. Breyer's amusement flickered, giving way to something subtler, calculation. He leaned back, steepling his fingers, the faintest tension in his jaw betraying a growing awareness that this was no ordinary argument. Micro-conflicts emerged in the silence. A clerk shifted nervously. A juror's eyes narrowed. A photographer adjusted the lens, capturing the quiet drama unfolding in real time. The room was a living organism, reacting to the unspoken battle between experience and conviction. Then came a rhetorical jab, subtle yet precise. Breyer's voice, firm but strained with the effort to maintain levity, asked, "Do you truly believe that moral clarity can override decades of established law?" It was a question of centuries in microcosm, authority versus principle. Murmurs swelled quietly, half skepticism, half awe. The tension was almost unbearable, a current running beneath every heartbeat in the room. Crockett's reply was almost imperceptibly sharp, yet elegant. "Respect for the law does not require blind obedience," she said. "And respect for authority does not excuse moral abdication. When the law fails the people, it is the duty of those who serve it to correct, not to conceal." The room reacted immediately. A suppressed gasp, a shuffle of papers, the faint click of a pen set down. Even seasoned observers sensed the magnitude of the statement, the quiet audacity that made it resonate beyond the walls. Breyer's eyes flickered, a hint of tension replacing the earlier amusement. He interjected again, testing her resolve. Each question carefully crafted to probe limits, to challenge, to see if conviction could withstand scrutiny. Crockett answered, each response measured, authoritative, unwavering. She punctuated her points with pauses that allowed the weight of her words to settle, letting the courtroom feel their impact. Every exchange became a microdrama, every glance a narrative, every sigh a subtle verdict from the audience. Shifts in the courtroom were almost imperceptible but undeniable. Spectators leaned forward, hands tightened around notepads. A young law student's jaw dropped in recognition of the audacity before her. Breyer, the seasoned master of calm, was visibly calculating, forced to adjust, to react, to confront a challenge unlike any he had encountered in decades of jurisprudence. The dialogue had become more than argument. It was a duel, a test of principle against authority, intellect against courage. And yet, throughout the volley of questions and answers, Crockett remained composed, a calm center in a storm of legal and moral tension. The energy in the room escalated, a crescendo building, signaling that what was unfolding was no mere courtroom exchange. This was a reckoning in motion, a confrontation that would ripple far beyond these walls. Murmurs swelled quietly, half skepticism, half awe. The tension was almost unbearable, a current running beneath every heartbeat in the room. Crockett inhaled slowly, letting the tension settle into a tangible weight that pressed on every shoulder in the courtroom. She did not rush. Every eye, every camera, every reporter's pen, every whispered thought of the spectators seemed to pulse in unison with her heartbeat. This was the moment she had been preparing for her entire life. The culmination of every case, every argument, every lesson learned from struggle and sacrifice. The pause stretched deliberate, drawing the room into a suspended, almost sacred silence. Breyer, until now the embodiment of measured authority, watched with a faint curl of amusement at the edge of his lips. His decades of experience, his mastery of rhetoric, had trained him to anticipate and deflect challenges. He had faced formidable attorneys, seasoned litigators who could twist logic into knots, and yet here he had detected something different, something unsettling. Crockett's composure was not merely defiance. It was a quiet, unwavering force, and the courtroom felt it instantly. Finally, she spoke. Her words were calm, precise, and deliberate. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying a weight that seemed to settle over the room like a shadow. "Authority without accountability is tyranny. Tradition without justice is empty. And laughter in the face of those whose rights are at stake is a failure, not of law, but of moral courage." The effect was instantaneous. A whisper rippled to the gallery, soft at first, then louder, as if every person present needed to affirm that they had heard correctly. Breyer's smirk faltered, the corners of his mouth twitching as the words sank in. The room seemed to shrink, the polish would press in closer, the chandeliers above flickering in imagined synchronization with the gasps. Every clerk, reporter, and spectator leaned forward, caught in a gravitational pull toward the force of Crockett's moral certainty. The pause that followed was cinematic in its tension. Breyer's amusement, once a shield of dominance, froze into a stunned silence. He opened his mouth to respond, then hesitated, the words caught somewhere between protocol and incredulity. The courtroom held its breath again. Whispers rose and fell, a collective intake of wonder, as if the very air recognized the gravity of what had been said. Somewhere in the back, a journalist's pen trembled, the scratch of ink punctuating the room's suspended heartbeat. Outside, though unseen, the ripples of this moment began to spread. Social media imagined it as it would in the hours to come. A thread of stunned commentators, viral clips of the courtroom, hashtags multiplying in real time. Analysts dissected every syllable, every inflection, speculating on the impact this counterattack would have on public perception, legal precedent, and cultural discourse. Every network would replay it. Every news feed would pulse with the undeniable energy of a moral reckoning. Crockett's words had become a signal fire, an undeniable proclamation that courage and principle could, even for a moment, dominate authority. Inside the courtroom, the tension deepened. Breyer's fingers drummed lightly against the bench, a rhythm betraying the meticulous mind at work, now forced to reconcile surprise with centuries of cultivated poise. His eyes, normally calm and analytical, darted for a fleeting instant, betraying the vulnerability beneath decades of mastery. Crockett did not flinch. She did not waver. Her voice remained steady, her posture composed, her presence commanding without ever needing to demand attention. The contrast was stark. The seasoned titan, the law momentarily unmoored, and the rising force of moral clarity radiating unassailable strength. She continued, layering the argument with the subtlety of a strategist and the gravity of someone whose entire life had prepared her for this moment. We cannot allow tradition to silence truth, nor authority to eclipse conscience. Every precedent, every law, every rule exists to serve the people. When it fails them, our duty is not deference, it is action. Each phrase landed like a deliberate strike, precise and unyielding. The courtroom reacted in microcosms. A nod here, a gasp there, a clerk exchanging a glance with a colleague, silently acknowledging the force of her words. Breyer's silence lengthened, a pause pregnant with internal calculation. He was not simply being respectful. He was processing the unexpected challenge to the power he had long relied upon. The courtroom had become a tableau of contrast. Seasoned authority weighed against fearless conviction. Every observer, whether in a room or imagining it through media, felt the narrative crystallize. This was not just a legal argument. This was a moral duel, and the outcome was being defined in real time. The tension was cinematic, almost unbearable in its intensity. Crockett allowed the pause to stretch, letting her presence fill the space like an unspoken verdict. Judges leaned forward, anticipating the next word, the next move, the subtle shift that would indicate whether authority would reassert itself or yield to clarity. Every cell in the room seemed attuned to her rhythm. Even Breyer's breathing, careful and deliberate, could not mask the subtle acknowledgement that he had underestimated the force before him. Then came the final blow, delivered not with aggression, but with unassailable precision. "Your Honor," Crockett said, each syllable measured, "the law is not a shield for comfort, nor a platform for amusement. It is the promise we make to each other as a society, that rights are protected, that dignity is preserved, and that justice prevails. Anything less is failure, and that is the accountability we must demand, not tomorrow, not next term, but today, in this very courtroom." A shiver ran through the audience. The words had settled like a verdict in the air, undeniable and irrevocable. Whispers erupted, half in awe, half in disbelief. Cameras clicked. Pens scratched furiously, and spectators, momentarily suspended between history and immediacy, leaned closer as if proximity could make the weight of truth more tangible. Breyer, the unflappable, the composed, the seasoned, remained seated, but the shift was palpable. The laughter, the smirk, the subtle amusement, all gone, replaced by a recognition of the sheer force of moral authority standing before him. Outside the walls, the world imagined the scene, social media igniting with every retelling. Clips circulated instantly. Commentators replayed her phrases, dissected their meaning, speculated on their impact. The courtroom's microcosm became a global event. The peak of hero versus villain crystallized in a single, unforgettable exchange. Crockett's precision, clarity, and courage had transformed a legal argument into a spectacle of principle, a moment that would echo in conversations far beyond the building, far beyond the legal world. The contrast could not have been clearer. Breyer, the master of decades, reduced in this instant not by incompetence, but by the sheer force of challenger who refused to yield. Crockett, the rising star of justice, unshaken and unassailable, a figure defined by empathy, integrity, and unwavering principle. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath collectively. Every person sensing the magnitude of the moment, the moral clarity piercing through layers of tradition and authority. And in that suspended heartbeat, the energy of every struggle, every victory, every lesson Crockett had endured converged. By the time the gavel echoed its final note, the courtroom had emptied, but the world outside was already alight. Phones buzzed incessantly. News feeds flooded with video clips of Crockett's words. Each frame replayed, slowed, dissected, and shared. Hashtags multiplied like wildfire. Hashtag justice spoken. Hashtag Crockett moment. Hashtag moral authority. Hashtag Breyer shocked. Memes emerged, some irreverent, some reverent, but all amplifying the unmistakable truth. This was a defining cultural moment. Every replay reinforced the image of composed, fearless lawyers standing against tradition, wielding principle like a weapon of undeniable clarity. Politicians weighed, and almost immediately, Some lauded her courage, framing Crockett as a beacon for a generation of reformers and advocates long frustrated by hierarchical inertia. Others, more cautious, acknowledged the spectacle while debating its implications on judicial protocol and public perception. Yet even the critics could not dismiss the seismic effect. The event had sparked a discourse about power, accountability, and the role of moral courage in institutions built to resist challenge. Journalists and commentators seized the narrative with relentless energy. Cable news cycled through analysis panels, replaying the defining moments in slow motion, dissecting her phrasing, her pauses, the subtle inflections that had punctuated each sentence. Op-eds flourished across every platform, each offering interpretations, praise, or critique, but consensus was undeniable. Crockett had shifted the conversation. Talk shows debated her impact. Podcasts dissected the legal precision behind her arguments, and newspapers splashed headlines declaring her a new standard-bearer of principled advocacy. Even celebrities and public figures, far removed from the legal sphere, joined the chorus. Tweets of admiration highlighted the courage required to confront entrenched authority with clarity and calm. Instagram posts celebrated her moral clarity, sharing still frames from the courtroom with captions like "fearless in the face of power" and "integrity never goes out of style." Crockett became a symbol, not just of legal brilliance, but of an aspirational ethos, that courage, preparation, and empathy could upend long-held hierarchies and spark meaningful dialogue. Public admiration swelled, particularly among younger audiences and communities historically marginalized by institutional authority. For many, Crockett represented validation, a confirmation that their voices mattered, that defiance rooted in principle could prevail, and that entrenched power could be questioned without fear. Social media communities exploded with personal stories of standing up to injustice, framing Crockett's triumph as inspiration and proof that moral clarity could transcend traditional barriers. Legal circles, too, felt the ripples. Law firms, bar associations, and academic institutions debated the implications of her approach, analyzing not just the rhetoric but the substance. Law students dissected her pauses, her phrasing, her sequencing of arguments as lessons in precision, strategic pacing, and the fusion of intellect with moral authority. Professors cited the moment as a case study, emphasizing how courage and preparation intersected with law to produce outcomes that were not only legally sound but culturally resonant. Political commentators drew lines connecting her courtroom performance to broader societal trends. They debated whether this signaled a shift in public expectations for authority, whether it would inspire future reformers, and how institutions would respond to the new standard she had set. The conversation was layered, complex, and far-reaching. Crockett's words were no longer confined to the room. They had become touchstones in a national dialogue about ethics, accountability, and the courage required to challenge power without compromise. Amid the viral clips and trending hashtags, the impact was also deeply personal. Individuals shared stories of resilience, of small acts of courage previously dismissed or undervalued, inspired to recognize their own capacity to speak truth to power. Activists cited her example in campaigns, educators used it in classrooms, and ordinary citizens referenced it in conversations about rights, justice, and moral responsibility. The moment had transcended the boundaries of a courtroom, becoming a cultural touchstone, a symbol of what was possible when preparation, principle, and courage converged. And yet, beyond the immediate spectacle, beyond the tweets, memes, and viral videos, the moment demanded reflection. While public discourse celebrated Crockett's brilliance, the deeper implications stretched further. Questions of authority, tradition, and accountability had been reframed, and the conversation had moved from the abstract to the tangible, from theory to lived experience. The courtroom might have emptied, but the conversation it sparked had only begun. But beyond the viral clips and headlines, a deeper lesson emerged. The courtroom had emptied, but the echo of courage lingered, reverberating far beyond the walls. Crockett's composure, her unwavering moral clarity, had done more than silence a judge's laughter. It offered a blueprint for heroism. It was a quiet heroism, not born of spectacle or self-interest, but principle, preparation, and the courage to act when others might flinch. Every word she had spoken, every pause she had held, radiated a dignity that demanded recognition, not because it sought fame, but because it reminded the world of what leadership truly required. Across the nation, citizens and public servants alike drew inspiration from her example. In offices, classrooms, and homes, people reflected on the quiet power of integrity, of speaking truth to authority even when it seemed impossible. Crockett's performance was not a moment of fleeting drama. It was a living lesson that courage does not need to be loud to be transformative, that dignity is a shield stronger than mockery, and that calm reasoning can dismantle even the most entrenched authority. She had modeled a rare combination of intellect, empathy, and courage, a combination that transcended legal strategy and entered the realm of moral instruction. In the aftermath, discussions turned inward as much as outward. What did it mean for individuals to confront injustice in their daily lives? What did it mean for institutions to be reminded that power carries responsibility, not immunity? Crockett's triumph illuminated universal truth. Real leadership is measured not by the applause it receives, but by the courage it inspires. She had reminded a nation that service requires sacrifice, that authority must be accountable, and that integrity must guide every decision, regardless of personal or institutional pressures. Her example resonated because it was attainable. Crockett was not invincible. She was human, shaped by struggle, perseverance, and principled determination. Yet, within that humanity, she revealed an aspirational model. One could navigate power with intelligence and grace, confront authority with precision and dignity, and influence outcomes without abandoning principle. This was a heroism that did not require theatrics or aggression, only steadfast courage and an unshakable commitment to truth. The cinematic crescendo, our courtroom moment, became a symbol. Across social media and news platforms, citizens share reflections not just on what she had achieved, but on how she achieved it. Teachers used the clip to spark discussions about ethics, responsibility, and civic engagement. Activists cited it as a benchmark for advocacy rooted in preparation and moral clarity. Every day, people recognize that speaking truth, serving the community, and holding fast to integrity were acts of heroism within their reach. Crockett's composure became a mirror, reflecting the best possible version of leadership that any individual or institution could aspire to embody. And yet, the moral lesson extended beyond applause or admiration. It reminded the nation that courage is contagious, that dignity can outlast mockery, and that reasoned advocacy can outshine authority when the latter is untempered by accountability. It was a call to action, not just for lawyers, politicians, or public figures, but for anyone willing to stand for justice, for fairness, and for the enduring principles that bind society together. The quiet, unwavering courage she displayed was a template for how every citizen could confront the challenges before them, whether in public office, community engagement, or personal decision-making. The final image, etched into collective memory, was not of a courtroom or a gavel, but of a person standing firm, calm, and resolute, an embodiment of integrity meeting opportunity. It was cinematic in its simplicity. The hero, composed and dignified, having spoken truth in the face of laughter, and having, in doing so, shifted the narrative of power itself. Every citizen who witnessed the moment in person or through the ripples it created sensed that they had glimpsed something rare, the essence of leadership that is courageous, principled, and enduring. And in that quiet triumph, the nation glimpsed what real leadership looks like. The courtroom moment that defined Jasmine Crockett's rise was more than legal history. It was a lesson in courage, integrity, and moral clarity. When she faced a seasoned authority figure, unflinching in her truth and composed in her conviction, she reminded the nation that real power belongs not to the loudest or most senior, but to those who act with principle. The laughter that once echoed in the courtroom had been silenced, replaced by a force far stronger: reason, empathy, and fearless advocacy. This moment resonates because it is universal. It speaks to anyone who has ever confronted injustice, anyone who has felt their voice dismissed, anyone who has faced a system designed to intimidate rather than empower. Crockett's courage is a mirror, reflecting the potential within each of us to stand firm, speak truth, and demand accountability, not just in courts of law, but in our communities, workplaces, and daily lives. Now it's your turn to join the conversation. Share your reflections on moments when courage mattered, or when principle overcame intimidation. Comment on how integrity and moral clarity have shaped your own experiences. Subscribe to stay inspired by stories of individuals who refuse to back down in the face of authority, and share this video to amplify lessons of courage and accountability. Every voice matters. Every action counts, and every story of bravery adds to the collective strength of those who dare to stand up. Remember, the world changes when we act with conviction, when we prioritize principle over ego, and when we embrace the courage to speak truth to power. Engage, reflect, and be part of the movement, because leadership is not given, it is earned through action, and inspiration begins with you.